Hello, St. Patrick. Rob Maslowski here again for today's Gospel Reflection. Today we're continuing to dive into John chapter 6. Today is the Tuesday of the third week of Easter, which means we are reading in today's Gospel John chapter 6, verses 30 through 35. So if you haven't read it yet, I encourage you to take a moment and read it and then join us back for the rest of this video. And also, if you didn't see yesterday's reflection on the verses preceding this, I encourage you to watch that as well if you have a chance. We're going to dive right in because I think these 6 verses that we focus on today contain a lot of hope for us in these unprecedented times that we're living in. With churches being closed and a global pandemic going on, and I'm sure many folks experiencing anxieties and stress and fears of what's to come, and perhaps loneliness and all sorts of different things that people are experiencing during these times. These 6 verses contain a lot of hope for us because Christ reminds us that He is the bread of life. And I think when we truly understand what that means, it can provide us with a lot of hope. And it can provide us with the sort of faith that can combat against these times, because unprecedented times require unprecedented faith. And so when we understand that Jesus is the bread of life, He says in the last verse, Jesus said to them, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never hunger, and whoever believes in me will never thirst." Jesus makes it very clear that if we rely on Him, if we go to Him in our needs, He will always provide for us. We will not leave hungry. We will not leave thirsty. And I think especially these days with churches being closed for public masses, I think one of the great ways that we may be feeling hungry is that desire for the bread of life, the Eucharist, desiring to receive Christ's body and blood, soul and divinity in the Eucharist at Mass. I think many of us are feeling that missing piece in our faith life right now. But I think it's important to realize that by no means is this global pandemic the only time that there have been Christians in the world that have not been able to receive the Eucharist when they've desired it most. You know, throughout the world, there are places and all throughout history, there have been times in which people, faithful Christians have been not able to gather for Mass. Whether it's because celebrating the Mass is illegal, or perhaps they just don't simply have enough priests to bring the Eucharist to them. And so the Christian faithful have survived times like this since the beginning of the church. And why is that? The reality is that the graces in the Eucharist are not only available in the Eucharist. And let me explain that, because I think at first glance that might seem like it's incorrect. But the reality is that although we as humans realize that the sacraments that Christ gives us in His church are the most effective way to receive His graces, the most effective way to be sanctified for Him. And certainly in the Eucharist is the most effective way to grow closer to Him. It is the source and summit of our faith. Although that may be true for us, we also have to recognize that God implements His sacraments. He creates those sacraments for us. And so as a result, God is not bound by His own sacraments. God can work outside of His sacraments when needed. And we see this in other sacraments. We recognize it pretty easily. When perhaps a young child or even an adult who desires baptism, or a child whose parents desire baptism for them, tragically dies before being able to receive the sacrament of baptism and being washed of their sins by water, still have the opportunity to receive those baptismal graces through a baptism of desire. Or even in confession, let's say a young man is on an airplane that is about to crash and makes an authentic confession to God, and there's not a priest available. That does not by any means mean that the grace of absolution is withheld from him. And it's the same in the Eucharist. By no means do I think that a God who loves us and a God that is merciful and loving and desires to be close to us withholds those graces from us in the Eucharist simply because we cannot gather and receive the Eucharist in the way that we typically would. And that's why a spiritual communion each day as part of a daily mass or as part of our Sunday mass, for as long as this whole situation goes on and we're not able to gather together, a spiritual communion and a true and authentic spiritual communion is incredibly important, because Christ still desires to provide us with those graces, and he desires us to be his church. And we need those graces to be his church, especially these days. And so this week, as we continue to talk about the Eucharist and as we continue to go through John chapter 6, I encourage you to continue to receive those graces, continue to ask for those graces in whatever way they're available to us right now. Thank you.